Hello, everyone. This is Panzer Penguin coming to you with another Global War 1936 to 1945 video. Today's topic is politics, which certainly deserves its own episode. And today I am joined by White Shadow, aka American Mark. Um,
How you folks doing today?
he is distinguished from Danish Mark, who is another player, so keep that in mind. Um, so politics, clearly, as I've alluded to in the previous video and other videos of this game, politics in this game are a little bit different than they are in Axis and Allies, and you can see that just by their name. In Axis and Allies, you just have the Axis versus the Allies. In Global War, you have the Axis versus the Allies versus the Comintern, who would be the Russian uh, Federation or the USSR in this case. Um, that may seem kind of confusing to some people, but there's a very good explanation for it, along with how alliances and the functionality works for such things. Um, Mark, uh, let's start with what are your opinions, for instance, on how the politics in this game work?
Oh, I think the politics in this game make this game what this game truly is. I love that it brings that actual history alive in this game, and each nation has their own separate goals and agenda, but it's working towards this greater objective as to basically win. Like for example, France doesn't want communists in Spain, so it kind of it's like has to do maybe like allow Lend-Lease from Germany to go through France to make sure that communism does not spread in Spain, because if that's the case, then France loses a victory objective. But then you're giving one away, so it's heavy-handed at certain points. It's very dynamic, very interesting, and not only that, it just brings the game alive as far as conversation goes.
Exactly. In the first video, when we were sort of talking about some of the differences with Raccoon, another player, uh, between Axis and Allies, we were talking about those victory objectives that appear in this game, where yeah, you may have a common goal of defeating Germany, but how much aid does the United States want to send to Russia? Because you don't necessarily want the Russian player to accomplish all of their goals, because at the end of the game, when you tally all the victory points, and I believe there are 18 per alliance, um, so it's whoever gets the most technically wins the game once the last turn is over. So yeah, you may not want to give them too much aid, but at the same time, if you don't give them enough, then maybe maybe Germany defeats Russia or something, and you come out on the losing side again. So there's like a very fine line to toe with how much the Allies help the Russians. Obviously, the Axis want to help each other as much as they can to accomplish their joint goals, so their alliance can win. But it just adds a new sort of facet to the game where it's not just black versus white. It's black versus gray versus white. There's a lot of variation with the politics in this game. Um,
Absolutely, absolutely. There's so much checks and balances. If you do one thing, it might be great for you, but then it might hurt your ally, your partner, or i- just because it does something well for you, it might stifle somebody else that might be with you, and you really need to talk about it, and that's where the politics in this game come alive.
exactly. Um, and we see that especially once Russia is invaded by Germany, the United States, who's keeping an eye on the Japanese and what the Japanese are doing. They do need to theoretically send aid to Russia, and you can either do that in the form of a unit or money for Russia to spend as they see fit. But at the same time, you need to balance out how much of that money you keep for yourself, so you can start gearing up for war against Japan. Um,
Correct.
so real quickly, we'll just go over who encompasses the three alliances, and obviously they're all the major countries in the game. So the Allies are made up of the United States, the Commonwealth, and we'll go into what the Commonwealth is towards the end of this video, and France is included into there as well, though it's kind of like a minor major. The Axis, who are basically the main enemies in this game, would be the tripartite, which would be the Germans, Italians, and the Japanese, while the Russians solely make up the Comintern. Um, and there are some minor countries that at the start of the game are controlled by these alliances, and I'll go into that in a second. But for instance, France is aligned to Abyssinia down here in Africa. So on the first turn, when Italy is invading there, the French player or whoever's controlling the French rolls for that. The nationalist Chinese are controlled by the United States, while the communist Chinese are controlled by Russia, and of course, nationalist Spain is controlled by Germany, and Republican Spain is controlled by Russia as well. Um, so people may be wondering, what does control and alignment mean? So I'm just going to go over what neutrality is, what control is, and what alignment is, because you can be a major power, but you can be neutral, which some people, oh, but you're in the Allies, how does that make you neutral? So neutrality is when a major power is uh, not at war with another major power. So you lose your neutrality when a major power, so the United States, the Commonwealth, Russia, Germany, Italy, Japan, uh, when any of those go to war with each other, they are no longer neutral. And that's sort of when they become part of whatever alliance they belong to. A minor power, so any other country, um, is neutral until they are aligned to a major power who is at war with another major power. And I'll go into that here in a minute. And uh, a rule governing neutrality is that major powers may not fly over or enter a neutral nation without a declaration of war.
Correct.
Um, which
Which brings another dynamic.
exactly. I mean, it kind of goes without saying. Would you be happy if your neighbor started flying jets over your country or something? Probably not. Um, this also
Exactly.
applies to the canals and straits that are in the game. For instance, Denmark is a neutral nation, but it controls the Danish Straits. Only German and Russian ships may pass through those straits. The United States and the British are not allowed to move through unless they control Denmark for whatever reason. Um,
Right. And you can't just as an ally. So for example, England would have to pay a heavy 10 IPP penalty just to attack Denmark and take it, unless otherwise Germany has taken it beforehand. Then you obviously don't have to pay a penalty. But if you wanted to go that route, yeah, I mean it's the dynamic of this game, as you were saying. The politics of it is an ally. You don't go after a neutral nation, you know. But if it helps you in the longer run, you know what I mean? You're paying a penalty, but is it really worth it, or is there another way to go about it?
right? Especially since early on in the game, if you look at the United Kingdom's income, they're only making 11 IPP per turn. So to spend 10 of that to go to war against a neutral nation probably isn't really worth it that early on in the game. So that's something I like about this game, where the allies who aren't at their war goal, and we're going to save war goals and peacetime income probably for the next video, but basically the allied powers, until they reach their war goal, their wartime economy, they are not allowed to attack anyone. The only people they can attack are neutral nations, but they have to pay a fee to do that, because I mean, you're basically a democratic nation. Your people don't want to go to war. While the Axis, on the other hand, they're all ruled under dictatorships, so the people don't really have a say. So the Axis powers can attack a neutral at any time. However, their penalty for doing that is that the Allied nations either gain some money towards their wartime goal that allows them to declare war on the Axis, or a few other things may happen, but that's all relatively easy to find out by looking at the rules or looking at the country cards.
Correct.
So we keep mentioning control, and it's a term that basically explains itself. But control is limited decision making a player has over a non-aligned neutral minor power. So, for instance, let's say no major powers are at war, but uh, Russia declares war on Turkey. So what happens then? So because Russia is part of the Comintern, that means Turkey comes under control of the Axis, so the German player in this instance. Um, what that means is that the German player rolls the defensive die for Turkey. They collect the income of Turkey, which let's say it's just 3, and they use that money to buy Turkish units in Turkey because that money's staying in Turkey, and then they can use Turkish units to counterattack the Russians. The only thing Germany cannot do while controlling Turkey is they cannot take an action that would put Turkey at war with another major power. So, for instance, you would not be able to invade Syria as Turkey under the current circumstances.
Correct. Correct.
Um, I think that pretty much covers control, and control leads directly into alignment. So let's say Turkey and Russia are still at war, and Germany declares war on Russia. So now you have two major powers at war with each other, which means that since Turkey is at war with Russia, Turkey becomes under German alignment. What that means is that all Turkish territories now become German, and all Turkish units become German, and their income goes to Germany. Germany collects their income for the German total. So that's
Correct.
pretty much what alliance is. It's when major powers also align with each other when that happens. So when France and Great Britain are both at war with Germany, they then align with each other and become actual allies as part of the Allies' political group, which then allows them to move into each other's territory. Until they are both at war with Germany, you cannot have British or French troops crossing the border into each other's countries. Like we said, the minor power aligns with a major when they're both at war with the same major power. Now, the only time there's an exception to this um, is in China. So the nationalist Chinese and the communist Chinese, they are controlled. So the American player makes the purchasing decisions for China, the Russian for the communists. But when those two countries are at war with major powers and everything, nothing really happens to the Chinese. Yes, the Americans and the Russians can both be fighting the Chinese, the Japanese, but the Chinese remain independent. And this is the only time that this happens, partially due to the fact that the either one of the Chinese powers can actually turn into a major power. Um, the Chinese Civil War uh, says that whoever wins, you eliminate all the forces of your enemy, and once you do that, you then attain a major power status and can start doing things that all the major powers can do.
Absolutely. And you know what? You could have fun with it and just not even attack China and let China try to eat itself.
Exactly. Um, so then, spheres of influence. So how do you determine who controls who in what area? So it's pretty easy. So nations align with the Allies if the Axis declare war on them, with the exception of Mongolia. If Japan declares war on Mongolia, Mongolia goes Russian. I believe that is the only case that a country aligns itself with the Soviets. Um,
In Spain, if the Comintern win in Spain.
and with the Republic in Spain. So if the Spanish Civil War ends before any major powers at war, uh, and Spain is technically all Republican, then Spain aligns with Russia once Russia is at war with Germany, which is incentive for the Germans to win. However, if the war is ongoing when Germany and Russia go to war, the Republican troops align with Russia and the nationalist troops align with Germany. So you kind of have like a little side theater of Germany fighting Russia, um, which makes things interesting. Um,
Agreed.
so we so nations align with the Allies with the Axis declare war on them, and they are controlled by the Allies if they are attacked by the Axis, but the attacking power is not at war with the Allies. So in the Western Hemisphere, so the Americas, the United States takes control and alignment over nations that are attacked by the Axis, while everywhere else that happens, so the rest of the map, the Commonwealth takes over control. Um, in regards to the Axis, if nations align with the Axis, if the Allies or Russia declares war on them, and they're also controlled by the Axis, if they're not, if the Allies or the Russians aren't at war with the Germans. So every country in the world will become under German control or alignment during a Russian or Allied attack. The only exception would be Siam, which would go to the Japanese alignment if it has, if it's attacked for whatever reason before it actually aligns with Japan, which happens in 38 or 39. I'd have to double check that. Um, and then, of course, Mongolian Republic and Spain are the only nations that are controlled or aligned to Russia during attack by anybody else. Um, so that's pretty simple, I believe. If you guys have questions on any of this stuff, obviously you leave a comment and I'll respond with a clearer answer if any of this is confusing. Um, so as we've seen in our weekly game sessions, uh, there are some country specific conditions for alignment without declarations of war or as a result of declarations of war. Um, so, for instance, Poland, uh, on the turn that France and Great Britain are at war with Germany, if Poland has not been conquered yet, then it aligns to Great Britain. Um, and that's an exception. There's no need for a declaration of war on Poland for it to align. If it has not been aligned by the time both Britain and France, or if it has not been conquered by the time both Britain and France are at war with Germany, then it aligns. Um, Another instance for when it aligns is if Germany and Great Britain are at war and Germany invades Poland, um, or on the turn that Germany invades Poland and it doesn't take Warsaw, then the rest of Poland aligns with the Commonwealth, with the British. Uh, the Pan American nations, which we kind of just touched on, so basically everyone except for Argentina, once the United States is at war with another major power, they can spend up to 3 money per country to attempt to influence it to uh, align with the United States. You then roll a 12-sided die, and you have to match the amount of money you spent or roll less than. So you have to roll a 1 through a 3, depending on how much you've spent to try and influence them, to try and align them. And you add 1 to the number needed if enemy submarines have hunted along the New York to Rio de Janeiro uh, convoy line. So, that's kind of obviously Axis submarines raiding American convoys is going to sway South America more towards joining the Allies. Um, those are the only exceptions in regards to countries aligning to the Allies without the aforementioned declaration of war by the Axis onto those countries.
So I have an interesting question then to
Sure.
pose you. If, for example, if Germany's at war with Britain and France prior to 1939, does Poland align to Britain once the start of January of 1939, even though Germany did not do hostilities towards Poland?
So, it says Britain may align Poland on the turn Britain and France are at war with Germany if Poland is unconquered by the start of the British turn. There's no time limit or start date for that. So should the German player be very aggressive and before say 1939, the conditions exist where both Britain and France are at war with Germany on the start of the first British turn where that condition exists, the condition being Germany is at war with France and Great Britain, then Poland aligns. Poland turns British.
Yeah, see, because what jumped out at me was in 1939 scenario, Poland begins a line to Britain. So
Correct.
then, yeah,
And I
it,
believe the reason for that is that's historically what
right.
started off World War II.
Oh,
Germany
absolutely.
is at war with Poland in the start of that scenario. Um,
I I do love the fact that it's not, this game is, you bring the heritage of what Axis and Allies has, but in this game it's more dynamic, it's more involved, it's more complex. It takes it to another level. You go from checkers to chess, and it's beautiful. The map is gorgeous. I mean, even reading the Axis alignment conditions, it's
right.
it's
With each turn being 6 months, I found that generally speaking, uh, the balance of the game almost kicks off the historical dates around the same time that they historically started. If you play as Germany, you do find yourself uh, basically attacking Poland on a historical date, and the same with France, because the longer you wait, the stronger the Allies can get. And the closer they get to their wartime goal, the the more aggressive you need to be as Germany. But speaking of the Axis alignment conditions, um, in the 1939 version of this game, the Global War 1939, not the scenario, but the different board and everything. Uh, what I liked about that was the fact that Germany got to control the Axis minors that historically, Hungary, Romania, Bulgaria, and to an extent Finland, and that happens again. It's slightly different. Um, so in this case, the Germans once per turn may move into Austria, the Sudetenland, and Slovakia. Prior to everything, but as soon as Paris falls, the German just verbally declares that they're aligning, let's say, Hungary, and so once per turn after Paris falls, they get to align either Hungary, Romania, or Bulgaria. Um, and should those nations not be aligned with Germany when Germany declares war on Russia, the second Germany declares war on Russia, they all align with the Germans. So that means Germany gains control of the territories, their units, and the income value from possessing those territories. Finland is a little bit different this time around. If the Russians declare war on Finland just out of the blue, then Finland is controlled by Germany until Germany and Russia are at war. But if the Molotov and Ribbentrop Pact is signed, which can be signed in 1939 in this game, and I believe it's in July
July
of
39.
July of 30. I mean, historically it was signed in August of 39. Um, if that pact is signed, then the Russians are allowed to attack Viipuri, the easternmost Finnish territory, with no repercussions. And then Finland aligns as per neutral rules after that. If Russia attacks the rest of Finland afterwards. Um,
Right. And what I like really that adds to that, exactly what you're saying, is that if you encompass perhaps even in your strategy where you don't necessarily align Romania and all the other Baltic states immediately, then if they stay relatively neutral in January 41 and then January 42, depending on what your strategy, you gain more units so that when you finally do go to war with Russia, you're basically getting a few extra free
Right.
units.
Throughout the game, there are certain turns where neutral countries, if they're still neutral, gain an additional unit or two. Um, I don't know if you would wait with the Axis miners for that, because I mean you're gaining more money in their units the sooner you align them. But of
True.
course, Russia gets closer to its war goal for every German territory on its border. So if you align Romania, then Russia gets to roll a die to increase their income because there is now a German territory on the border of Russia. Or if you don't sign the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact and Germany takes eastern Poland or the Baltic states, same deal. For every territory, Russia increases its goal towards wartime income.
Absolutely. And then if you don't sign the pact, you pretty much could leave Romania left open to Russian attack into it because Russia is able to attack neutral nations start of
Correct.
39.
Correct. Um,
Oh,
the other Axis leaning countries. We've already gone over nationalist Spain. Um, should nationalist Spain, however, win the Spanish Civil War, the Germans either have to possess London or both Gibraltar and the Suez Canal in order for nationalist Spain to align with Germany. Turkey will align with Germany if there are if Germany is in possession of Transcaucasia, which also would trigger Iraq, because Iraq will align with Germany or Italy at the end of any combat phase if there are German or Italian land units in any land zone adjacent to Iraq. So if Germany is able to take this territory here, this turns Turkey into uh, ally or axis alignment, which means this unit here in Kars would be the German land unit next to Iraq, which would then trigger Iraq joining the ally or the Axis. So, sort of a domino effect, taking Transcaucasia from the
absolutely.
Russians.
But you got and that's the thing with Russia. You have to protect so many different fronts because you could just do something as cheesy as loading up a paratrooper in Romania and dropping them off in Transcaucasia.
Exactly, and
Just tidal wave of domino.
if you're not aware of the reach of your enemy, it can bite you in the butt. Sweden aligns with Germany if Russia declares war on Denmark or Norway, as long as those countries are neutral. Um, Not really sure why Russia would do that, but I guess that's what happens. And then we mentioned Argentina earlier being the exception to the Allies. Argentina is very pro-Axis, so once per game, so only one time during a game, Germany can attempt to align Argentina once Germany is at war with a major power. Germany pays 2 IPP to the bank and rolls a die. On a 1 or 2, Argentina becomes Axis aligned. The United States income is increased by 1 die as well. And like I said, Germany may only make 1 attempt per game. And then, yes, Siam aligns with Japan in July of 39. Uh, the only people who align with the Russians are the Republican Spain, um, and that's as soon as Russia is at war with Germany, any Republican Spain, whether they won the Civil War, it's still going, they align with Russia. Um, so
I
I
agree.
think that pretty much covers everything. Um, when all the major powers are at war, so Russia's at war with Germany, the Americans, the British, and the French. One thing to keep in mind is that Britain, France, and the United States can freely move through each other's territories. If France has been conquered by the Germans and, say, American troops land in Normandy, possession of Normandy goes to France, not to the Americans, because you're liberating the country. Um, the place where this gets complicated is with Russia. United States troops or any allied troops cannot move into Russian territories. However, let's say Germany has conquered a Russian territory. Well, in that case, you can, because you're attacking a German territory, and you gain possession. It doesn't go back to Russia. You can, and it works both ways. You can then at some point state that you are returning, this Russian territory back to Russia. But if you do that, you have to immediately move your units out of that territory into a allied friendly territory.
Correct.
Obviously, Germany and Italy and Japan can freely move through all their countries once they're all at war with the same uh, enemies, which obviously happens eventually. But that could be, let's say Republican Spain won the uh, Civil War, so Germany has come in and conquered Spain, but then the Allies come in and liberate Spain. Well, they don't have to give those territories back to Russia, and that prevents Russia from getting, uh, or I guess it enables France at the end of the game to get its victory objective where there are no Russian troops on its border. Because even though
Correct.
these are technically Russian provinces, they're controlled by the Allies until they're given back to Russia. So some interesting land exchanges could happen between the alliances.
I believe now also in the alliances, you could you not allowed to share each other's like naval base or
Correct.
airfield. So that makes it also very, very interesting, especially for the United States to go so far from home, to go into Europe, to not be able to really, and it changed because in Axis and Allies, you can share naval ports, air bases, and all that fun stuff. But in this game, you have to pretty much bring everything with you and go about it that way, and it makes it challenging, but it's rewarding in that sense because you're able to accomplish a lot, and it changes up, I guess the dynamic of it. Where do you want to focus more or less? How the game's going, um, the allies, the axis, the it's here I am rambling, but I think the game is absolutely brilliant.
Uh, Obviously, I'm in agreement with that. So the last thing, which I promised to go over at the beginning of this video, and we're gonna try and wrap things up here in the next 5 or 10 minutes, is the Commonwealth. Now, the Commonwealth is unique in regards. If you look down here, the Commonwealth consists of three basically separate countries. Excuse me. So you have Great Britain in Europe, you have the Far East Command in India, and you have ANZAC in Australia and New Zealand. Now, they all move, attack, and defend at the same time, but even though they kind of exist as three separate countries, um, you have to keep some things in mind. It says it right here on all the cards. Um, so if we read uh, the British Commonwealth part of the cards on the Far East and ANZAC, says the British Commonwealth includes Great Britain, Far East Command, and ANZAC. Far East Command shares the same technology marker and per turn limits on technology development the rest of the British Commonwealth. The Far East Command shares the same per turn lending lease limits with the rest of the British Commonwealth. Um, to make it clear, um, basically, uh, the Commonwealth is one nation. It's just divided into three groups so that the combined income is not all spent in one location. It's spread out throughout the world. Uh, Helps with the gameplay and everything. So if Great Britain purchases the tech role for Jet Fighter, then the Far East and ANZAC cannot also purchase a tech role for the Jet Fighter. It's shared across the three. So if you roll and you get a tech as Great Britain, that tech is then shared with Far East and ANZAC. As Great Britain, you may not lend lease to the Far East or ANZAC. The United States or France would have to lend lease units or money to those locations. Um, uh, the part where it gets a little bit confusing is when Great Britain is at war with Germany, but the Far East and ANZAC are not, so they don't get bumped up to their wartime economy. It's only when Japan declares war on Anzac or the Far East, that they gain their wartime economies. So they're
How
separate, but they're not separate, but they are separate.
Right, and it brings an interesting, situation also when you include what happens with the Dutch East Indies and the Netherlands when and if you choose to go to war with them, how that gets distributed, split, who gets possession, and so on and so forth.
Right. And and, and that can be a topic for another video. But
I
uh,
What I do like you were saying before, is combat arms. How you can attack Japan, for example, with combined with Calcutta and Anzac in one motion because they are technically moving at the same turn. So
exactly,
that
because they're, for all intents and purposes, they are the same nation. I mean, it's just like historically, you know, Great Britain had its armed forces, then it had a lot of colonial troops from places like India and Anzac. Anzac, for instance, stands for the Australian and New Zealand Army Corps, which were under British control, and they not only fought in the Pacific, but they were also in Italy, and they were also in Western Europe
and in Africa.
and in Africa. The Canadians are the one exception in this game. For whatever reason, the Canadians didn't really make it into Global War 1936. Um,
You have an expansion coming up though, so that is in the works, which is going to
that
be
is
very nice.
that is true. But you can, as Great Britain, receive lend lease from the United States through the Canadian capital of Ottawa. It doesn't need to go transatlantic. Uh, which is an interesting tidbit. And I guess that would really be of importance if Germany has a large submarine presence in the Atlantic and can or could potentially interdict uh, Lend Lease. Um, but I think. Oh, I guess the one thing we forgot to mention in China is that so you have the nationalist Chinese, which are these 5 territories here. You have the communists. Then you have a bunch of warlords in all these other Chinese territories around it. When Japan declares war on any of those warlords or any of the communists or the nationalists, then all of these warlords align with the nationalist Chinese. Um,
Correct.
so if the KMT, which is the Kuomintang, the KMT Chinese, the nationalist Chinese, if they declare war on one of the warlords, uh, nothing, the rest don't align with the communists or anything. It's just a war between the nationalists and that particular warlord. Um,
Correct. And then it makes you think, though, as a Chinese player, because if Japan goes around a strategy where they don't attack China whatsoever, China basically has to defeat all the warlords and then the communist China for KMT to be unified, a whole, to actually declare war. If not, you know, that takes time. It takes energy. That takes manpower. And you know what? That's Japan is no longer really focused on that. So then that takes away that alignment instantly, so it's really really interesting how the way it's all set up, and I like it. I really do. Lend lease is difficult, especially for the Soviet Union to actually aid communist China. It's not like they can fly men over. There's no direct rail access or anything like that, so something has to be kind of set up and built for them, so that if the Soviets wanted to help the CCP, um, but China is definitely fun and interesting, and don't overlook it. Don't let them sleep.
Certainly the case. So I think that's going to call it a wrap here on this politics video. So Mark, appreciate you joining me today to make this video for everybody.
Always, always, Panther. Thank you very much for having me. Thank you, everyone, for listening.
So we'll come out with another video later or next week. I'm not sure which one I plan on making yet, because there are quite a few things still to go over. But I'll figure something else, or figure something else out. So this is Panzer Penguin signing off, and I'll see you next time.